Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I'll be your host. Today's guest is Judith Johnson. Judith Johnson is an educator whose mission is to help others master the art of being true to themselves. For over 40 years, she's been studying and teaching the dynamics of how our beliefs inform our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as individuals and in our relationships, social order, culture, and institutions. Johnson's work draws upon her own life lessons, wisdom teachings from around the world, doctoral degrees in social psychology and spiritual science, and her experience mentoring others. Ordained as an interfaith minister in 1985, she serves as a chaplain at her local hospital and counsels the grieving. Johnson is the author of Writing Meaningful Wedding Vows and Live in New York's Hudson Valley. And she is now releasing her next exciting book, Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide in liberating ourselves from the death taboo. Judith, it's such an honor to have you on the show today.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure.
I'm curious, what inspired you to write this book? I mean, this is obviously an extremely important subject, but what drove you to write this book?
Well, personal experience, really. I was just, cruising along through my life when my mother fell backwards down a flight of stairs, cracked her head open, and ended up in the emergency room, which started the last 6 months of her life. And I had been primary caregiver for her for the last 9 years of her life. And it exposed me to how dysfunctional our society is in relationship to aging and dying, and how much upside potential there is if we can start shifting how we relate to those areas of life.
So working with her and kind of going through this process, with carrying her for the last 6 months. I mean, what were some of the lessons that you learned, going through this process?
Oh, there were so many lessons. First of all, it taught me that as a caregiver, I needed care. And I didn't know that going through it. That was something that I learned after the fact by burning myself out. It taught me how important love is and making the time and space to be available to our loved ones when they're leaving. It taught me that I had more courage than I knew I had. It taught me not to be afraid of death, that it's such a natural process. And a lot of that lesson came through the support of hospice. Hospice was wonderful. There is a point in the journey of somebody who's dying. It's like, where do you hit the point between I'm trying this new drug therapy or this new treatment or I'm going to have this surgery to try and get better. And then there's a point at which there's a recognition that, sometimes the treatments are really causing more trouble than helping. And so there is a point at which we all have to accept the dying process. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when they hear the word hospice, they run away. It's like, oh, no, hospice means we're dying. I don't want that. Because it's an acknowledgement, rather than recognizing that it means bringing in a team of people who know how to lovingly and practically function around the dying process.
And so, one of the things that you are really kind of driving home with the book, and it's this that we have, you mentioned we have such a fear of hospice, try to run away from that because that means that's kind of an end stage of a person's life. So we don't want to get closer to that. But just death as a whole, that seems to be such a great taboo, as you mentioned in your book, here in the Western society. I mean, why do you think that is so?
The way I see it, the death taboo is at the core of our dualistic perspective through which we view birth as good and death as bad. And awakening from this collective delusion is the key to making peace with our mortality. When we do these polarized thought forms where this is good, that's bad, we have ourselves set up very deeply in our being to believe that death is something to be avoided, that all pain and suffering is to be avoided. But if you really think about it, these are normal things. I mean, we can't escape this. We might be able to delay it. But when we push away from something that's going to happen, we make ourselves unable to function effectively in dealing with it. And so our whole collective attitude in this death taboo makes us unable to really deal practically and effectively with the realities of death and dying. We can be so much more helpful to each other if we open to this reality.
So with, because death is so finite. I mean, so ending, and people are so scared of something that it just has a abrupt end, and so what are some of the things that we can do to get over that, to not be so afraid or have such great taboo about dying and death?
All right. Well, one of the things is there's a lot of things that we need to think more deeply about, and one of them is if you go and look up the word death in the dictionary, you're going to see that death is defined in terms of the physical body, in terms of our physiological processes coming to an end. And so that kind of supports the idea that we are a body and a personality, and that's all we are. And so this really, raises the question of when you refer to a person, it's death, the death of the body, or is that the end of everything, or is there some part of us that goes beyond that? So it really begs the question of a spiritual dimension to our lives. And for those who do not have a spiritual awareness of something greater than the physical body, death is the end. It is, lights out. It's all over. For those who have a more spiritual dimension, there's a sense of this is the end of this act. But there is more. There are other expressions. I don't know where I'm going, but, and there's lots of speculation, but there is not a sense of the finite ending. So
it almost seems then that people in preparation for, like you mentioned, that death is inevitable. Yeah, it is going to happen. And just by pushing it further into the future and not think about it or plan it or be at peace with it or talking about it, you are then, it will just happen without you being ready for it. But working then more on this spiritual component of what death looks like, it seems like it will put then an individual in a much better place and more at peace, and not try to keep them death at arm's length all the time.
Absolutely. It's like, when you think about anything that you avoid, like, for example, how many of us struggle with avoiding doing our taxes, and we postpone it, and then we finally do it. You know what I mean? When we avoid something, we end up expending so much energy fighting against it that we're not able to enjoy ourselves. Okay? And if you think about it simply on an energetic level, trying to pretend that we're not going to die is kind of like trying to hold a beach ball under the water. It takes a lot of energy We're not aware of it because so much of this is being spent unconsciously, okay? But alternatively, when we accept something, we empower ourselves to deal with it. So, for example, one of the ways that, and let me just say this, my book is structured to explain all about the death taboo, how it works, how it impacts us, and all of that in the first part of the book. But then the second part tells us how to get free. And, one of the key ways to get free is to get away from that dualistic thinking of right, wrong, good, bad. Another one is to get into absolutely the acceptance that this is a reality, okay? So what do I need to do? Like, a lot of people think, oh, I'm young, I don't need to think about that. But the reality is 28% of us will die before the age of 65. You don't have to be old to die. So understanding the truth and the reality about death makes it less scary. Preparing for it on many different levels. For example, having a will, having a healthcare proxy that names somebody to speak on your behalf about medical procedures at the end of life if you're unable to speak for yourself. If you don't do these things, in other words, if you let fear have a hold on you, then you don't get a say. But if you say, okay, I'm scared and I'm going to do this anyway, I'm going to fill out this piece of paper, I'm going to let my wishes be known. I'm going to think about what matters to me. When you think about it, for example, the process of filling out a healthcare proxy, it asks you to think about things like, do you want artificial nutrition? Do you want to, be resuscitated? And it gives you a chance to talk about under what circumstances you want what kinds of interventions. Now, if you don't let us know what matters to you and what you would prefer, then other people have authority, like in to make those decisions on your behalf. And they don't know what you want, and it puts a lot of pressure on other people to try and second-guess what you would like. Yeah,
and that's that's such valuable advice because accidents happen. People all of a sudden they fall ill. All of a sudden you have people, they do get cancer. They do get these different things that you think that you are immortal and that you're going to live forever, but there are events that take place and that can move you towards death much faster than expected. And then to have gone through all this and prepared yourself, you're all of a sudden, it becomes such a different experience. Going through that process, and if everything is just we just got to rush through the whole process.
Right, and you don't want to be thrown into it without having any skill. It's like I am so grateful for that 9 years caring for my mother, and the last 6 months were really, really difficult, but I now know how to encounter death. I now know how to love somebody and not let my fear get in the way. Those are things that will help us help each other and make that part of life an easier part of our journey. When you go into that in fear and without any skill, it makes it a lot harder. So why approach with, if you approach when you're in contraction, you are withholding your ability to function. We need to breathe into experiences of life, even the ones we don't like. People, it's not just death as the final thing, so to speak, but it's just all forms of pain and suffering. These are normal parts of life. Life isn't about just being happy all the time. We need to learn skill in coping with the ups and downs of life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She is the author of Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide to liberating ourselves from the death taboo. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She is the author of Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide to liberating ourselves from the death taboo. So, I mean, the death and the dying process is such a spiritual, powerful experience. I mean, can you speak a little bit about that so that people can really understand how important it is to just kind of be present during that moment and not have to deal with all that hustle and bustle like we're talking about, but to have that already done so that you can really be present at that moment.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point, which is having prepared for all the practicalities and the things that need to be done ahead of time, you free yourself to be able to be present and be present in sharing your loving and your comfort with the one who is dying. One of the most important things for us to do is practice talking about death with each other. One of the things that people get caught up in is everybody's so scared of upsetting each other. You know, it's like, oh, I don't want to upset her, so I'm going to try and protect this other person emotionally by not being emotionally vulnerable myself. And the reality is, when you are emotionally vulnerable, for example, I remember saying to my mother, I can't imagine living my life without you. I love you so much. And she, you know, we talked about it. But to have that conversation rather than to say, oh, you look great today, Mom, that's denial. That's pretending this isn't happening, okay? So the more that we open up and become real with each other, we allow our love to flow authentically between us, and we invite each other to be free to say and do whatever it is that we need to do. I was working with a client, I think it was yesterday, who was talking about the challenge when her father was dying. She was able to, she was the only person in the family who said, Dad, what is this like for you to know that you're dying? And he said, I'm so glad you asked. And they had deep, deep conversations about it. It's a very important thing. And let me just put in a plug here for, and if anybody's out there has not heard of death cafes, I highly recommend that you go to a website called deathcafes.com. This is a concept that started in 2011. Somebody came up with the idea in England of why don't we get total strangers to get together, have a cup of coffee, a piece of cake, and talk about death. Now, I don't know how they came up with that idea, but it really works. And that was 2011, and now there's over 13,000 death cafes in 81 countries around the world. And you can go on their website and find one near you. It is an amazing experience to find out how easy it is to talk about death to total strangers, and yet you can't open your mouth to your own parents or your sister or your spouse. And it shows us how much work we need to do there.
It almost seems to me that if we are more open and have this conversation, this real conversation, that it, because death is such an equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or whatever you've done in your life. You know, it's such an equalizer. Yeah. And if you put your place or put yourself in that vulnerable state, you know, where nothing else really matters, you know, then all of a sudden only the things that are truly important are the ones that you want to focus on and you want to have to be part of your life. So it's almost like if you bring that discussion into your life, you then all of a sudden realize what is important and what's not important, and then it brings that, you know, highlights that even more.
Absolutely. And you brought up a really important word, which is to be vulnerable. You know, for some reason, we've been sold a bill of goods that we're supposed to be in control all the time. And control is one of the greatest illusions, because all you have to do is try to be in control and you'll find out that you're not, you know. But especially around death, to surrender to the journey And there are ups and downs. I mean, there were times with my mother where things would kind of plateau for weeks or months, and then there'd be a precipitous decline. You don't know what the path is going to look like, and you just have to bring yourself present in your loving each day, in loving service and caring for one another. It's such an opportunity to really demonstrate our love for each other. Like for me, doing this for my mother, I mean, she birthed me, she brought me into this world on the other end of the whole journey. And for me to have the privilege of being able to assist her as she left this world, that was a great honor and a privilege for me. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life.
Yeah.
It was hard.
I can imagine.
It was hard, but it was so intimate.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that the most intimate, the most powerful experiences are seldom the easiest ones.
Right. And isn't that interesting how much we avoid pain and suffering, and yet if we will just breathe into it, that's where we reap the greatest rewards of wisdom and experience in our lives. I remember when I was working on my second doctorate in the field of spiritual science, I came to a point where I was focusing on the issue of trust of myself, trust of others, trust of God, trust of life, And I had this tremendous epiphany when I was demonstrating to somebody that I felt like I had been living my life as though I had my arms stretched out, like straight forward with my hands up like stop signs, kind of living life as though if I can keep you that far away from me, I can manage, because you won't be able to hurt me. And then I realized, my goodness, I have bone spurs in my shoulders and carpal tunnel in my wrists. And it was kind of the body showing me, and this is something that you in your field will appreciate, is that I literally practiced rounding my shoulders and dropping my arms and pressing my heart out into the world and leading with the vulnerability of my heart, moment by moment.
I love that. Let's take a quick break.
Yeah.
You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She is the author of the book, Making Peace with Death and Dying. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She is the author of Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide to liberating ourselves from the death taboo. And I just want to kind of highlight that again, like we're talking about how important that moment of death is. I did one of the fascinating interviews that I did along the line was with Dr. Christopher Kerr. He wrote a book, Death is But a Dream, where they did a study of 2,000 individuals and observed them through their dying process, and kind of seeing what took place and recognizing that the power that exists within that process, and how beautiful it is, and how evolving it is. That's the spiritual journey that an individual goes through while they're going through that process. It seems to me that we have lost a lot of that here in our Western society, where we are almost kind of wanting to tuck people away that are dying so we don't have to see it and have to be reminded about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I can say from my own experience with my mother, it was beautiful. It was really beautiful. I'd just like to share a quick story. My mother, she knew that, let me backtrack and say we have so much focus on the physical, and we put people in hospitals and they're on all of these equipment, all these machines are breathing them and doing all of this stuff, and we're desperately trying to restore life rather than respecting the process of death. And I remember my mother was in the hospital, and this was 2 weeks before her death. And one of the things that I was most aware of through the whole journey was all the stages of consciousness that shifted as we went through the journey. You know, even just that moment of accepting she's dying rather than desperately trying to restore her life, you know, and the surrender into that. And it was a relief when we surrendered and accepted she's dying. Now we're doing dying, you know. And 2 weeks before she died, I got a desperate call from her from the hospital. And I thought, oh, my God, this is it. She's dying. But I got into the hospital, and she was radiant, absolutely radiant. Now, she knew that many years ago I had an experience that I always refer to as the day I stopped believing in God, because what happened was I had an experience where belief, it became not an intellectual process, but an actual experience of experiencing God's presence. Now, that's not anything you can translate or communicate to another human being, but it's an amazing experience. She knew that had happened to me and had always been a little jealous that that hadn't happened to her, and it happened 2 weeks before she died. She was having a breathing treatment, and she really got clearly inside herself, oh, my God, I'm being breathed. You know, what a thought. I'm being breathed. And for her, for whatever reason, that translated into her knowing that God was real. Okay, that it wasn't some made-up idea that we had, and that God was breathing her, and she was over the moon, and she was as solid of mind as any of us, okay, right through to the end. And everybody who came in her room, she would be like, God is real. And they'd be, yes, dear, as though she's some senile old lady. But she was trying to communicate this magnificent lesson that she had had. And all day she asked me, when are they going to make the announcement? And I asked, what announcement and who? She thought that the president of the United States, the Pope, and I don't remember the third person, were all going to make this life-changing announcement that God is real. She said, God is real. People will want to live their lives differently. And I just love that line because, you know, whether you believe in God or not, just take the time to think about and awaken a sense of a higher dimension than just the physical reality we live in. So many people are missing out on that, and there's so much to be had.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the thing is that when you have that physical experience rather than what you were talking about, the intellectual understanding of that God exists, but then to really
right.
have that, you know, that core experience of that this is what this is truth. It becomes it's hard almost then to see people not really feeling what you're feeling.
Right. But on the other hand, for me, it's given me much greater compassion and much greater motivation to help people shift their focus and get centered inside themselves. We spend so much time trying to measure up to some elusive external standards. When you even just think about the design of our being, everything is focused outward. And I think this is one of the great ironies of life, is that the real treasures are inside our own experience. And we don't spend enough time looking at that and harvesting that.
And you think that this is one of the reasons why we are so afraid of death, because we're looking at the cessation of something physical. And if we then focus more on the spiritual journey, the mystical journey, then the physical is not as important. We recognize there's just so much more to it.
Right, and to be fair, it's kind of like it's a shared journey. I mean, it's understanding that there are more dimensions to it. You know, it's like seeing life in black and white, and then finding out, oh my goodness, there's Technicolor to be had. But if you only focus on the physical, and you're worried about what does my body look like, and how do my clothes fit, and who do you like me, and if that's only things that you're thinking about, you're missing out on the fact that you are a unique being who's having a life journey. What's it like to be you? What are you learning about life? What matters to you? And people are not encouraged enough to ask those deeper, important questions and to spend time in that territory of deeply knowing ourselves. And when we don't know ourselves, what are we doing?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She's the author of Making Peace with Death and Dying. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Judith Johnson. She is the author of Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide to liberating ourselves from the death taboo. So, we've been discussing kind of how we view death here in the Western society, but how about in other cultures like Eastern philosophy, Buddhism? How do they view death? I mean, do they have the same fear, or do they deal with it differently?
It's totally different. I'm so glad you brought that up. I have a whole section in the book about Buddhist perspectives on death and dying. And imagine growing. I mean, we grow up in this society with fear. Okay? Imagine if instead you grew up in a state of consciousness that recognized life as an impermanent state. It comes and it goes, like clouds in the sky. And you have this much broader sense of cycles of nature, of things moving through space and time, of not staying the same, and that's normal. So even just the state of the thoughts of impermanence are important. And there's also a lot of beliefs in Eastern thinking that have to do with what are we doing while we're here. And it all revolves around clearing up and learning how to have a clean, clear state of consciousness, how to be peaceful inside yourself. And so learning techniques like that, learning not to, for example, in Buddhism, you're taught to avoid grasping for things, trying to grab onto things and hold on to things. So attachment and avoidance, it becomes a practice of letting go. Don't grab, don't hold, just be. So it keeps bringing you home to the state of being rather than the state of having and doing and getting and acquiring and all of that we seem to get so obsessed with. And there are lots of different cultural approaches to death and dying, but ours has really unfortunately gotten way far away from anything that's natural.
Yeah, I agree. And something, in regards to the impermanence, I mean, in Buddhist philosophy, obviously anything that is impermanent, it's unreal. And then we were talking about who am I if I'm not this physical body, or if I'm not, this successful career, who am I? And by doing that, kind of looking at that a little bit deeper, then you are, I guess you set yourself up in a more peaceful state, because you are not so, like you mentioned the word grasping. We're not grasping the physical reality, but we're at peace with how things are flowing.
And the focus of where our attention goes, if your attention is flowing inward and upward rather than outward, into the world of stuff and, all of that interrelationship. It's not about avoiding relationships and things like that. They're very important, but how are you participating? It's centering in your own experience and valuing the inner experience and becoming much more acquainted with it, and also becoming acquainted with the fact that things change all the time. We're always dealing with change. And
what are some of the costs that we experience, when we are living is this kind of trying to deny death, so to say, keep it at an arm's length, where we're developing carpal tunnel and bone spurs. But what
in my book I go. Yeah, in the book I go through what I call the 10 major costs and consequences of the death taboo, which really are to motivate us to, hey, I don't want to live like this. One of them is living in fear. When we live in fear, we're in contraction. We're approaching things when we're disabled from functioning effectively. Another one is being ill-informed, unprepared, and ill-equipped for death. We live in this pretending that death doesn't exist. But it does. And if we pretend it doesn't exist, that means I'm not getting prepared. I'm not going to be masterful at doing this. I want to be good at this. If I'm going to do this, I want to do a good job. Another one is this seeking the fountain of youth rather than fully embracing all phases of life. Why should we just embrace youth and young bodies and things like that rather than say, well, it's normal to age. I mean, and things do change. When we deny that, we make it wrong. So that's a really important one. Another one is emotional isolation. If I'm not going to talk to you about death and I'm going to pretend it doesn't happen, or I try to protect you, like, for example, how many people get a life-threatening diagnosis and they don't want to tell their loved ones because they don't want to upset them? Well, excuse me. You tell them so that they can love and support you through the journey and put their arms around you, But when we isolate emotionally, we shut each other out, and that's not a good way to go through this. There's a lot of disconnection that we experience. We postpone and avoid end-of-life planning. That's huge. Everybody who says, "Oh, I can do it later, I'm still young." No, do it now. We deny the power of grief. That's another one. Grief has its own way with each person, and it shakes you to the core of your being. When you lose somebody that you love dearly, I work with a lot of people who have lost spouses, for example, and all of a sudden their lives, all the routines of their lives are different, and they're all the times in the day where they normally would say, "Honey, oh, wait a minute, honey isn't there anymore." It's like this person who has been part of the normal living and breathing of their everyday life is no longer there. And we grieve differently, each different death. No two people grieve the same way, and one person doesn't grieve two deaths the same way. But it is a huge force that we need to make space for. And we're only very recently starting to make headway in corporations and all to make time for grief. For many years, the average number of days that somebody got off for the death of a primary family member was like 4 days. You don't finish grieving in 4 days. You don't become fully functional in 4 days. And so we need to allow ourselves the release that comes with grief. And there's a lot of costs of death in the workplace. 1 in 10 individuals in the workplace are grieving some major loss in their life at any point in time. These are huge things, our medical model has been set up simply to deal with life, but not to deal with the dying process. It's only about keeping you alive. And it's only in the recent years with the advent of hospice that we are learning how to do dying. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of hospice. One of the things I wish everybody knew is that the word hospice is not synonymous with, oh no, I don't want to go there because that means I'm acknowledging death. No, hospice means your person is dying and you have an opportunity to have people surround you who know how to do death well. They were wonderful.
Yeah. How is an individual, when you are going through, you're interacting with somebody that's dying? I mean, like you mentioned earlier, is that you you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, and you feel that if you're talking about death with them, that they it's almost like you've already accepted that they're dying, and then we've let them go, and then how do you feel that how should a person interact with an individual that is dying? I mean, what would be kind of the appropriate, so that it is the most uplifting, positive experience that one can have?
That is such a great question, and I guess I'd approach it two ways. It depends on the nature of the relationship that you have with that person. But if it's somebody with whom you have a loving, caring relationship, the first thing I would say is keep the loving and caring flowing. Don't, because sometimes when we go into fear, we forget that what about the person I love is going through this experience. And so keep the expression of love alive. And the other thing is to recognize that person is the one who's dying. Take your cues from them. It's their death. And even if you think you know better than they do how or what they should do in this process, and if they disagree with you, your job is to support them in their journey of dying. It's not to tell them how to do it. So, a lot of times we try to resort to being in control. No, be vulnerable. Be in your loving. Let them know you love them. And if they don't want to talk about it, then you don't talk about it. But if they do, but you open doors of opportunity. You ask them, do you want to talk about how you're feeling about what's going on? Ask leading questions. And if you get clear answers of, no, I'm fine. If maybe they don't want to talk, maybe they want to just be isolated. Let them lead the way.
Yes, you shouldn't really push the subject if they are really not wanting to go there. You're just kind of like you're mentioning. You're just to be there, be in love, and be supportive through the process, whatever that may be. Because the process I would assume is different for everybody. I mean, it's just like childbirth. Yes, there are certain components of it that's similar, but how everything is taking place in an order, that's different. It's unique.
Right. And absolutely. And also, people don't know what to do. One of the primary things you do is focus on what, find out, what do you need? How can I help you? That's one of the ways that, when I say stay in your loving, well, what does that look like? What do you need? How can I help you? Also, if you find that the person, for example, is not seeming to be in reality about the fact that they're dying, like they're the ones in denial, you might speak to the doctor or somebody on the nursing staff and say, is there somebody who might talk to them, who might help them, who's not a family member or a loved one? I know it was very meaningful to my mother, for example, having the support of the hospice team, to help her talk about things that she, for example, didn't want to burden me with.
Mm-hmm.
So be resourceful. Go ahead.
And I also think, what do you think about the individual themselves? I mean, we mentioned be there, be loving, let them take the lead, mm-hmm. But some people may be afraid themselves of dying, so that they're kind of in that space of fear because it is the unknown. I mean, how do you feel an individual should address that and approach that?
Well, what comes to my mind immediately when you ask that is, and again, it depends on the nature of your relationship. I know for myself, even in dealing with hospice patients before COVID, or not hospice patients, people who were dying in the hospital while I'm a chaplain, sometimes just a physical touch, just, is it okay if I touch you? And just kind of a gentle rubbing of their hand and saying, how are you doing? How's it going for you? is there anything you want to talk about? Is there anything I can do to help you? You know, again, if they're afraid, it's not your job to make them unafraid, okay? Some people go to their death afraid and aren't able to transition out of that. All you can do is open some doors of love and comfort and caring. You know, but it's like, this is going to sound really crazy, but this is what just came up. I remember I was in a consulting business years ago, and I used to get kind of attached to the idea of people wanting our business, you know, and when we do a pitch and they didn't want our work, I felt, you know, rejected. And my boss said to me, you've got to go with a state of consciousness of as though you're at a picnic and you're passing out the mustard and ketchup, and you're going to people saying, did you want mustard or ketchup with that? This is the kind of detachment that we need to have with a loved one. We need to let them know that we're there and we love them, but we need to respect and trust their process. And if their process is one of fear, then we try and present some thoughts about being more, you know, about being less fearful, and maybe helping see if you can get resources in there that help them. Ask the doctor if perhaps there is something that they can do for them. But don't try to change and fix it. Help, but don't try to take control. And I know that's a very fine line, but it's a very important thing to let the person who's dying have their journey. It's spiritually important.
I love that. Well, Judith, thank you so much for coming onto the show today. This is such a incredibly important lesson, you know, and you know, piece of knowledge for us to have as we're going through life, to understand all aspects of life, you know, which death is obviously one of the extremely important aspects of life. So thank you so much for taking this step and bringing this out to the world.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
That is it for today. You're listening to Health Made Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.